Welcome to a town that once kept a piano in the front room. Names etched into church ledgers, kerosene halos on rough-cut boards, and then in one night a rumor, a smoke trail, and a silence that pretended to be law. Rosewood, January 1923. A place breathing pine and resolve. Step softly, the floor remembers, hear the chord he left half played. See a hand hovering above ivory, like a man balanced between staying and running, speaking and silence. His name is Sylvester, and this room is too small for the decision it's about to hold. Outside, not frost, but the damp weight of pine air. The thin breath of a town holding itself together. Steps on sand. Slow. Chosen. The murmur of men practicing authority like a hymn they don't deserve. Sound rolls along the plank road, scrapes over the store porch, gathers near the carrier house, and the right place and the church that smells of sap and stubbornness. A cough. A boot nudges a stone. The music inside tries to make itself smaller. In the next room, a mother keeps her prayer threadbare so it won't break. Even the dogs understand when not to speak. Some stories begin with a headline. This one begins with a rumor. A window shade trembles. A lantern wick shrinks to coal. A belt is tightened that was already as tight as it could go. The first knock isn't a knock, it's a silence pressed against the door. Then the second, the third, and a voice that wants the night to believe it's right. You could say the street is empty, but that would be a lie. There are eyes behind everything, each making a ledger of what to remember and what to forget, to survive. Listen, do you hear the train that is not yet here? The rails humming an answer from miles away. The church steps creaking as if the building is shifting its weight, preparing to carry something larger than itself. This place speaks without words, pine needles ticking a window. Chickens restless when they should be asleep. A nail complaining in the porch beam with every small wind. If you drew a map of the night, you'd make the carrier house a lantern and shade the shape of decision closing in. He thinks of the small things that make a life the warmth a hymn leaves in piano wood. Rosin dust asleep in a cousin's violin case. The way a name fits in the mouth at the altar. Outside, men hold their certainty like it were law, not a story told twice. A rumor puts on a hat and a badge and knocks like duty. His finger finds middle C, and the room learns how loud a single truth can be, when everything else is noise. From the tree line, a mound lifts its head, then decides against it. A baby turns, presses its face into a mother's arm. Lamps make islands of yellow on a sea of dark between them. Crossings some will not attempt. In the store ledger, flour nails candles, and in penciled shorthand debts people days that tried to become one thing. On the road, cars anger men who do not know what they're about to start. A quiet that counts 1, 2, 3. Like a choir that hasn't chosen its hymn. If you came for certainty, learn to live with echoes. Ask which hour was the first wrong hour. Someone will say earlier, weeks earlier, a face in a doorway, a sentence outrunning the truth. Ask who lit the match. The night will show you 10 hands, and not one. Ask why a town can be erased faster than it can be built. The answer arrives as smoke thin, almost elegant, then heavier, then everywhere. But not yet. Not this breath, not while a chord still waits, not while a door hasn't chosen. A name falls from the porch, not his, but someone's, and it lands wrong on the boards. The world tightens. The piano becomes a monument to a dilemma. Making sound is sometimes the bravest thing, sometimes the worst. He lifts his hands, the keys remember him, white, silent, shining in a room that knows too much. He considers the window, not the pane, but the frame escape is measured in inches of wood, and hurt. His mother's silhouette holds the roof with an inch of chin. Say Rosewood, and you could think of a color. Or say Rosewood and know it was a plan to live, to own, to tend, to teach. A schoolyard chalking light into the late afternoon. Children half singing their sums. Sundays where road dust settled like a blessing. And this Tuesday when the gaze turns on the town, and the town flinches as though a gaze has weight. Rosewood caught the sun on its nails, made them look like gold small riches honest ones. It takes careful cruelty to hate a place for that. A frog starts its wet metronome in the ditch. Outside, patience shifts its feet. Far off, a whistle threads a line across the dark. He closes his eyes, hears a field song in the floorboards. A preacher's gravel in the stove. The newsprint hiss of a story sprinting to cities where men he'll never meet will make themselves judges. He counts his breath, as if counting could stop the world from skipping. The door knows it's a door that's the worst of it. It lives between. No good thing should live there long. There's the narrow shoulder of a road and the wide shoulder of a man who steps in front of his family because there's nowhere else to stand. A town isn't a place. It's a sentence subject. Verb, hope. Tonight there are men who would cross out the verb and call the sentence finished. Breathe with him in, out. Measure the space a life takes in a room this size. Put your hand on the piano top. Feel how sound leaves a ghost of warmth, insisting it was here. Trace the hairline crack down the wall. Tell yourself it's nothing, or admit what you know. Cracks learn their path from pressure, not time. When the first answer comes, it isn't words. It's movement, a step on a floor, answering a step on the porch. A line drawn by the weight of a man between his mother and the door, between his name and what they will try to make of it. Out by the trees, a night bird scolds the dark. Back on the road, 4 more lights decide to be witnesses. And somewhere else in this county, a conductor checks his watch. Unaware he's about to drive a kind of mercy. This is where we begin, not with conclusions. Not with the neatness history sometimes pretends to own, but with the breath before. The muscle held still. The rumor becoming a room. We begin with hands that know music choosing the geometry of defense. A small house makes itself a citadel pine. Prayer, a straight spine. A town that hasn't yet learned it is already a ghost in someone else's telling. Before you step further, say your time out loud, the hour, the minute, and mark the place you're listening from. Hold it against this room, this porch, this hush that comes before a match decides only light or fire. Then come closer. The door is still a door. The names are still names. And the night has not yet chosen what it will keep and what it will burn. January 1923. Levy County, Florida. A patchwork of pine flats and wet ditches of plank roads that forget themselves after rain. Of whistles in the distance that promise a timetable, a mercy, a way out. Rosewood sits here not on every map, not in the mouths of men who count counties by courthouse, and not by him, but it sits breathing gently as small towns do when they believe tomorrow will look like today if they work hard enough. The air has that tar-sweet smell of turpentine camps and fresh-cut boards. The sawmill's rasping breath rides the morning, and laundry lines, white careful, hopeful, lean between houses like handshakes no one will photograph. If you stand at the road's bend just after dawn, you'll see smoke lifting from cook stoves, hear a rooster who thinks duty is a song, and watch a boy trot a bucket to the pump, slapping his boots on puddles as if rhythm could pave the way. Rosewood did not fall from the sky. It was built, nail by nail, week by week, out of a stubborn sentence that began after the war and tried to keep its verb. Families came because land, even thin sand land, offered a different kind of arithmetic than wages alone. Because a small town with neighbors who know your children's names is a kind of wealth. Because owning a front step means your story has somewhere to sit. There are gardens here fenced just high enough to ask a rabbit to think twice. There are chicken coops, a smokehouse or two, a schoolhouse that tastes of chalk, chalk and pine pitch. A church that breathes hymns the way pines breathe resin. In summer, the gnats make confetti of the air. In winter, which is to say a Florida winter, the cold comes in from the trees, a damp thing that knows its way into seams and lungs. Beyond the neatness, beyond the quilts sunning on rails and the jars of peaches that look like stained glass when the light gets right, there is another geometry, the long spine of the railway. The store at Sumner, where credit is a leash or a lifeline depending on who's holding the other end. The courthouse roads that give some men names and reduce others to numbers. Jim Crow is not a rumor here. It is the everyday choreography where you stand at a counter, which door you use, which eyes you lower so you can raise your children. It is the price printed nowhere, collected everywhere. On paper, there are laws. In the world, there are habits that feel older than trees. To cross the county line is to cross between atmospheres, the weather of permission and the weather of warning. If you ask what keeps Rosewood breathing, someone will say wood plank, crosstie, shingle, and the work that makes wood into houses and rails. Someone else will say women's hands seeming salting balancing ledgers that count pennies until they sing. Someone else will say Sunday, the way a town straightens itself for a day and lets the better part of its voice out. The piano at the Carriers, not fancy but proud, is more than wood and wire. It is proof that a town can have music. That in a world determined to be loud, with the wrong things, you can make another kind of sound. The children know the roots of safety, the way city boys know trolley schedules, which fences are friendly, which porches grant refuge, which adults look at a child and see a future instead of a cost. But the world beyond Rosewood, the larger Florida of 1920, 1921, 1922, has been rehearsing another story. 3 years earlier in Ocoee Election Day, turned into a liturgy of terror smoke ash bodies not invited to testify. Newspapers wrote the day down like a problem solved. Families remembered it like an organ removed without anesthetic. In Levy County, stories travel by train and by mouth, by a man who learned something in Palatka and by a woman whose cousin came up from Tampa with eyes that wouldn't sit still. The Klan is not a ghost here. It's a schedule nights picked for marching, for reminding, for rehearsing the old sentence where some men are the subject and others are erased before the verb. Economies tighten. A bad season makes creditors brave. Turpentine operations shift, sawmills change hands, and every change of hands is another ledger nobody in Rosewood gets to see. White Sumner and black Rosewood share a road and a weather, but not a safety. Men in Sumner talk about property values, about a woman's cry heard wrong and repeated worse, about the way a rumor puts starch in a weak spine. In Rosewood, men talk softly and only to each other about how to make the month meet itself at the end, about the sound a truck makes when it should be in town and isn't, about whether you could move the piano if you had to. The sheriff's badge means one thing on one side of the county line and another thing on this side, and every man who has ever watched a badge pass him like a cloud knows the difference in his bones. Listen to the metal language of the rails, the far thrum that says a timetable exists somewhere, even if justice doesn't. A train can be a promise or an alibi. It can be a way to leave or a way for men who don't belong to arrive quickly and leave righteousness behind them like a receipt no one asked to see. The depot has its own smell-old paper dust that has learned to be patient oil that never quite dries. If you sit there long enough, you can inventory the county by faces, by hats, by silence. Voices carry too easily in a room like that. A careless word can go all the way to Cedar Key and back while you are still deciding whether to swallow your anger or spit it into the dirt like tobacco. What does a Tuesday look like in Rosewood? When everything is normal enough to want to last, men take tools that have their hands' memory carved into handles. Women count jars and loaves and steps. Plan the day's grammar wash, mend, save, teach. A teacher arrives not late, never late, and turns the blackboard into a kind of map for children who haven't walked beyond the county and already know more about weather than any book can teach. A baby learns to sleep through the sawmill's metal song. A dog learns which stranger is a stranger and which stranger is a threat. The church waits for evening, when voices will fold themselves into harmony and try to lift the roof by faith and practice. There is a store. Every story like this has a store, and in it a ledger. The ledger is never a stranger to anybody. It knows names in graphite and how to rub them out. It knows what flour cost in a week that nobody remembers, except the women who made bread that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. If you open that ledger, you could read a history nobody will ever publish: debts and kindnesses, grudges and graces, measured in pounds, in pennies, in days, taken from a man's back and put into a child's shoes. The ledger sits near a door that jingles when the wrong man walks in and goes silent when the right man leaves. On Sundays, clothing is ironed with a ferocity that feels like prayer. Hats are tilted at honest angles. The road dust behaves itself. The preacher knows not to waste verbs. A town like this keeps its dignity where nobody with a camera ever looks. It keeps it in the way men slow themselves at a child's gate so as not to scare a chicken. In the way a woman will choose the bruised peach for herself and the bright one for a guest. In the way a boy will walk the long way home, so his sister's new shoes won't find the mud patch that his own already knows by heart. Dignity is the thing you can carry when the law doesn't want you to carry anything else. But dignity and patience and the arithmetic of small gains have enemies. Some are predictable men who hate anything they do not own. Men who treat rumor like a rifle and aim it where the light is weakest. Others are softer, sneakier, a glance that lasts a beat too long at a porch where a woman sits. A sentence in a newspaper that chooses its nouns carefully and its verbs violently. A deputy's silence that the men who need loudness interpret as permission. The air in Florida knows thunder before it happens. So do towns. That prickling at the base of the skull. It's weather, and not the kind that cares about crops. Did Rosewood know? Really know what was coming? Knowing is an expensive verb. People here knew how fast a small thing becomes a large one, when the large thing already wanted to happen. They knew a white woman could cry the county awake and make it walk in one direction. They knew a black man's rebuttal does not travel as far as a white man's whisper. They knew a house can be both a shelter and a target. They also knew they were not alone, that there were names in Sumner that would not stomach certain lines crossed. That there were men like John Wright whose decency hid in practical acts, in doors left ajar at the right moment, in hands that pointed to the depot when pointing meant complicity to one world and salvation to another. The land holds its own minutes, palmetto hiding line of sight, low spots that keep a secret longer than any oath, pine rows that look like soldiers if you squint hard enough and want the metaphor to save you. Dogs map the town by smell. Children map it by safety. Men by what they can carry. Women by where they can hide the necessary thing in an unnecessary box. When the wind comes right, you can hear Cedar Key's gulls and believe in a geography that is larger than terror. When the wind goes wrong, you hear only truck tires and the sentence that follows them like a shadow. There is the matter of names. Carrier, Wright, Bradley, Morton. Names that fit in the mouth like work. Names that in some other county would have ended up on letterheads and buildings. Names that here are written in pencil so the world can pretend it did not mean to erase them when it does. There is the matter of dates. New Year's Day passes, and everybody tries to pretend that calendars change anything but the number you write on a bill. Newspapers in Tampa and Gainesville, in Jacksonville, watchful, hungry, are ready to put a frame on whatever happens next and sell it to readers who will never walk these roads. And there is the matter of night, which has its own politics. Night invites men to put on masks, literal or otherwise, and call it tradition. Night invites fear to practice being law. Now, look at the map you carry behind your eyes. Put a pin where the carrier house stands. Upright piano window shade. A mother who knows how to bind a wound and a promise. Put another at the right store, just far enough to be a bridge if a man decides to be a bridge. Lay a line along the track toward the depot, toward the idea of leaving, toward the idea that a timetable can still be a kind of covenant in a county where other covenants have already been broken. Set the air to a low tremor. Not yet thunder, not yet certainty, the kind of tremor that makes nails remember. They were once iron ore, and iron remembered it was once in the earth. Rosewood in the hour before a town is asked to prove itself is ordinary in the way that matters. Bread on a board. A dress mended along a seam that outlasted the need for mending. Ash moved to the corner of the yard so vegetables can eat old fires and make themselves into food. A boy trying a man's hat and pretending the brim doesn't fall into his eyes. A girl pretending she is older so the world will treat her accordingly, and a mother pretending she is not counting the ways the world fails at that. A man counting how many boards would carry how much weight if a piano suddenly needed to learn how to travel. This is the stage boards nailed. Curtains not yet drawn, actors who do not want to be actors. An audience that will pretend it did not buy a ticket. The political weather has been set by men who know how to turn fear into paper, and paper into orders, and orders into fire. The economic weather has been set by contracts that look neutral and behave cruel. The social weather, the old storm, never really moved off the coast. It only learned to describe itself as normal. And Rosewood, stubborn-built, loved, stands in that weather like a good coat that cannot stop the rain, only make it survivable, for a time. So when the knock comes again, when the truck tires draw their underlines on the road, when a voice mispronounces a name and pretends that grants power, you will understand what is being asked of a town that has already paid more than its share. You will feel the place in your chest where breath decides whether to be loud or quiet. You will know the difference between a house and a home, between the geometry of walls and the geometry of people standing inside them, choosing lines that will not be crossed. And you will hear under everything the thin, unwavering tone of rails, saying there is still a clock somewhere, there is still a timetable, there is still a chance that sequence can save a life, if someone can get there in time. Begin with the paper trail, the kind that yellows at the edges and still manages to hold its breath. In County Files, Levy County, January 1923. The first entries are quiet routine dockets, tax notes, a sheriff's mileage claim for a day that had not yet gone wrong. Then the ink changes temperature. A deputy's line, investigate disturbance. Sumner lands like a small stone thrown into a still pond. The ripples, they are not metaphor. They are telephones, boots, truck tires, and men who believe rumor can be a warrant if shouted often enough. A clerk underlines a time, 2:30 p.m. A woman's name spoken without its doubt, and from that moment, the file does not cool again. Newspapers pick up the scent. Tampa, Gainesville, Jacksonville, their columns tight, their verbs confident. Attack alleged mob form search underway. You can hear the type slapping the ribbon, that insistent tap that makes words feel like facts, even before they earn the title. The Florida Times-Union carries a version, then another. Small corrections that sound like pride clearing its throat. The Levy County Journal, closer to the ground, prints what it can confirm, and then under the pressure of men at counters and men at doors, prints what it is told to confirm. Headlines do not make room for ambiguities. Commas do sometimes. But commas belong to slower hours than these. Sheriff Walker's office logs bodies that are not yet bodies, posse assembled. House-surrounded shots exchanged. The passive voice arrives early, as if the paper itself were nervous about naming the hands that hold the torches. A house burned. Which house a man was killed? Which man? The file keeps ducking its head as though facts could lower their eyes on command. Then amidst the smoke of words, a name appears and refuses to be smudged. Carrier. Another line adds a woman's scream, another subtracts it, another insists it happened exactly as fear required. Somewhere a telegraph clicks into the wrong rhythm and spreads it like weather. There is a ledger at a store in Sumner, its graphite more candid than the county's ink. Debits for cartridges increase in a week that had no holiday for hunting. Kerosene tallied above the usual winter need. A margin note late. Late for what the paper doesn't say. Receipts at the depot show extra passengers on nights when the timetable wasn't meant to be generous. Names are abbreviated until they become codes JW, HM, RC. Men who will later say they barely remember the week and whose palms will never quite forget the heat of a torch head. Witness statements, if you can call them, that arrive like footprints in a high wind. A white farmer swears he saw a figure run. Later he admits he heard someone say that someone else had seen it. The math fails, but the sum remains permission. A black resident tells of shots from the dark. The deputy writes exchanged as if two directions of sound could share blame equally. The report notes excitement, the kind of fever the law pretends to diagnose but secretly prescribes. The temperature of the words climbs search, pursuit, justice. Between them, a blank where evidence should stand, and refuses. Maps enter the record, rough hand-drawn. The carrier home boxed in by a square of penciled trucks, and men the road to the right store traced with a careful unevenness that betrays a shaking hand. In one map, the church is labeled meeting place. In another, it disappears, replaced by the convenience of an empty lot. You can feel the pencil lift, hesitate, return to the page, as if the drawer hoped the erasure could happen here first and spare the boards the experience. It did not. Telegram traffic thickens county to county, then to Tallahassee. Send men. Assist. Mob gathered. Advise. The replies are brief, official, correct, and late. A militia unit is mentioned and then unmentioned. A governor's office prepares language for a statement even before it knows which nouns to defend. The speed of rumor outruns the speed of paper. The speed of trucks outruns the speed of trains. On the right store's counter, a hand writes a list of families with a pencil that stutters, and that list will be worth more than any proclamation made 3 days later from behind a desk. Photographs. But not the ones the audience expects. Not the lurid postcards that some counties made their trade. These are domestic, a parlor caught in the afterlight, scorched wall studs like ribs in a chest that tried too hard to breathe, a piano frame blackened, but intact strings warped into a stubborn harp. A photographer measures the room with his tripod and can't make his hands stop shaking long enough to level the spirit bubble. He develops the plates in a back room that smells of vinegar and despair. The results enter a folder no one asks to display on a courthouse wall. They will be found, years later, detached from their captions, carrying only the quiet fact of char. Census pages from 1920 give the before. Carrier family of ages. Occupations, literate, yes, property modest. Right merchant stock valued at children listed as. The tidy columns mark a town that existed in the grammar of the United States subject verb object. Ownership. Work, worship, school. Those lines do not prepare a reader for the edits the night will attempt. The 1930 census will be quieter, will skip a beat, will look away at the exact moment when a blank box becomes the loudest sentence on the page. Where are they now is not a field in the form. The silence enters where the number should have been and refuses to leave. Insurance papers surface like fish in muddied water. Claims for structures lost to riot, an actuarial phrase so cool it chills the hands that hold it. Some are denied outright owner absent cause disputed. Others are filed and filed again, then set aside under the respectable weight of a stamp that says insufficient. A clerk bored or decent writes in the margin known to be good people, then scratches it out. The file does not forget the mark. Neither will the person who wrote it. A railroad manifest shows a car stopped longer than scheduled near the depot, that week in error, or an act of conscience, or a man who understood that time, for once, could be elastic if lives were inside it. Military records whisper from another angle. A veteran's file notes service discharge address, Rosewood, then a redirection to another county months later. No explanation offered. A young man who had worn the nation's uniform finds that his name moves more easily than his house. A service medal lies in a box in a new town. Its ribbon will fray without an audience. The War Department does not ask why addresses change in bunches. Bureaucracies prefer arithmetic to anthropology. The facts stand in rows until someone teaches them how to march out of the file and into a courtroom. And courts. The proceedings, when they come, arrive exhausted. A grand jury impaneled testimonies gathered the record swollen with "I heard" and anemic in "I saw." The phrase insufficient evidence performs its grim trick, transforming the absence produced by fear into an absolution for those who cultivated it. A judge thanks the jurors. Men in the back of the room button their coats against a draft that isn't weather. Outside, the street resumes the posture of ordinary life, but step on the boards, and you can feel the note that doesn't resolve the one the piano in the carrier house holds even now in its bent wire. Freedmen's Bureau, long gone by 1923, leaves only echoes. But WPA interviews taken in the 1930s capture voices that remember the feel of these days, even when the dates tangle. An elderly woman recalls the night they said a woman cried, the sentence broken by a long inhale, and then the roads filled with men. A man describes the iron taste of smoke before a flame has the courtesy to be visible. The interviewer's typescript puts brackets around words he cannot decipher. The undeciphered parts are often the ones that matter most. Fact and memory do not cancel each other. They mark the same terrain with different inks. Church records, brittle but precise, show a line of baptisms, marriages, then a sudden hiatus. The minutes of a deacon's meeting stop mid-page, the secretary's hand steady, then absent for 3 months, then present again with a smaller congregation and a larger silence. Hymn numbers listed for Sundays that never got to sing them. A note in the margin, special collection for those who lost. No amounts entered. Perhaps the numbers were given to hands instead of to paper. Perhaps the hands were safer. School registers record attendance falling off a cliff in the second week of January. Children's names trail ellipses across the page where a teacher overwhelmed cannot complete the roll. In the corner, a multiplication table waits for students who will learn a different kind of math, how to calculate the weight a wagon can carry, when what it carries is more than objects. Chalk dust does what ash will soon do, makes a skin on everything, and insists on being noticed with every breath. And then there are the trains. The manifests that pretend to be indifferent and are not. A conductor's report notes unscheduled boardings near a particular milepost. The company's reply cautions against deviation. The conductor replies with no words at all, only a list of times and a neat, insubordinate checkmark next to each. Railway police make a report, brief, sterile, no incident observed, which is both true and false, depending on whether one believes that saving lives counts as an incident. The iron does not care. The men operating it do. In the years after, a state commission will convene transcripts typed on onion skin paper that makes each strike of the letter a sound like rain. Witnesses stumbled forward from old age and long silence, their narratives braided with stretches of the wordless. A map is unfolded on a table, and the room leans over it, as if leaning could make geography apologize. Compensation is calculated numbers that can never approach equivalence and then miraculously offered. The ledger of the state meets at last the ledger of a store in Sumner, and for a moment the columns align with something like justice. So these are the bones, the clerk's lines and the editor's choices, the sheriff's verbs and the deacon's missing minutes, the ledger's blunt arithmetic and the photograph's quiet burn. They do not sing by themselves. They wait for breath for names spoken without flinching for a town drawn back into the map by hand. The file closes, but not all the way. A strip of paper peeks out a date, a surname, a sum unpaid. The archive room exhales its dusty lung. Somewhere in that room, a string of the piano from the carrier house saved mislabeled miraculous hums when a train miles away drags its long note across the rails. Facts. Yes. But listen closely, they pulse, they warm, they tremble as if memory were electricity, and the record at last is beginning to conduct. Dusk falls. Not like a curtain, but like breath that someone holds a fraction too long. The first truck noses down the Sumner Road, lamps hooded men standing in the bed as if balance were a creed. A voice rides the cold names, mispronounced certainty over enunciated, and each syllable looks for a place to land. In the carrier house, air grows organized. A mother ties a scarf. A brother checks the latch. Sylvester's fingers hover over the place where Middle C once meant home. The distance between a window and a door, it shortens somehow when there are boots outside. The knock, when it comes, is not a question, it's a period. A demand built like a sentence that never intended to listen. Come out. The hallway learns how sound travels around corners. The piano's wires half-warped already from Florida's damp winters remember another law vibration seeks company. The house is a harp, the night a hand that plucks. A second knock. Then a hinge sighs, not from inside, not yet from the porch, where weight leans against wood that has earned its grain. Inside, a decision. It is not neat. Never is. A man chooses a line to hold a line drawn, with no ink, only stance and breath. A woman chooses a promise to keep. I will not let you be alone when they say your name wrong. A cousin chooses courage in a room that will ask for it all. The lamp is turned down not to hide, to teach the eyes how not to panic. A window shade breathes. Outside, a match scratches its small geography into the world. It fails, then tries again, succeeds. The smell of sulfur writes itself under the door. The first shot, no one agrees where it begins. A flash near the porch pole, a figure lurching in the yard, and someone yelling he's running. A muzzle flaring from the tree line where a man swore he wouldn't stand. The reports call it exchange, as if words could make symmetry where there was none. But inside the carrier house, it arrives like weather pressure. Concussion. The stair-step roll of sound that means more is coming. Splinters walk out of the wall and fall like tired insects. A hymn title comes to mind, unbidden. Hold to God's unchanging hand, and a mother hears herself hum one measure before swallowing it like medicine. Across town, the right store door opens and closes in a rhythm it was never built for. John Wright looks down at his hands, knows what they will be accused of later, no matter what they do, and decides anyway. He writes names too quickly to be neat. He tears a page he meant to keep. A wagon is made to be a sentence that carries a clause you don't say out loud to the depot, to the trees, to the next breath. He leaves his coat on a peg, a choice that looks like absent-mindedness, and is in fact a map. Meet me by the fence, he says to a boy whose job tonight is to pretend not to hear. Back at the house, heat without flame. The air compresses. A pane of glass decides to stop pretending to be strong and becomes glitter on the floor. A body falls outside which body no one will agree for years, and the night swallows its own name. They're bringing more, someone says, and the phrase is both detail and prophecy. It is not that bravery runs out, it is that walls have an arithmetic and wood answers to it. Every board can absorb only so much before it starts talking back in the language of cracks. Between bursts, the quiet is worse. In it, decisions mature. A cousin counts children like beads. 1, 2, 3 imagines each small back under a quilt. Imagines the quilt under a bed, imagines the bed under a roof that will insist on being wood. No matter what you pray, a man measures the window frame with his eyes, not width, but time. How many seconds for a body to pass a rectangle that outdoors believes it owns? The mother takes a breath that will have to last longer than most breaths have to, and with it, she repairs a courage she did not break. Then, the perimeter grows teeth. More trucks. Men who came to help and found themselves wanting to be part of a sentence that would read well on a porch the next day. Torches flare like arguments that don't need evidence. The yard becomes a geometry of light and shadow. And in that geometry, human shapes misunderstand themselves as justice. A voice that has always needed company gets it 3, 5, 10, and the echo gives the night the impression of a chorus. At the church, a deacon lays out blankets like pews for a different kind of service. A woman with a basket that looks like it only knows bread reveals it knows bandages too. The pump out back becomes a nurse water for burns that haven't happened yet, for lips that have forgotten how to be lips. A boy is told to run quietly to the right place with a sentence no one wants on paper. If the train can wait, make it wait. He runs like a comma fast, but making room for breath. The swamp teaches its class in silence. Palmetto laces itself into cover. Black water offers a different kind of reflection. Frogs seize the night with their clocks and dare men with guns to argue with time. Families tuck into the crease between tree and water. Mothers count the distance between a child's sob and a man's jealous ear. Fathers count steps by feel because counting out loud is another kind of light. Something crawls across an ankle. The ankle doesn't move. A mosquito writes its small signature in blood. The blood signs without comment. Out there, even the stars bring risk light that can betray a shape so people learn to be their own darkness, to wrap themselves in breath and leaf and the knowledge that morning has been promised for centuries and usually keeps its word. Back on the road, a vehicle lurches men loud, in the way men get loud to impress each other, when doubt gnaws under the belt. They ran to the woods. They're at rights. They doubled back. Rumor is a dog that doesn't heel it, runs ahead and barks at the first thing that moves. A deputy who believes himself a professional, even tonight tries to say enough fines that his voice has been filed down by the chorus until it cannot cut the air. He signals with his hand to lower the torches, a brief dim, then a flare, as someone lifts his higher out of spite. A house 2 doors down decides to be brave. Its people step into a shadow and hold their breath until shivering chooses to become prayer. A man who never owned a weapon in his life shoulders a door like a shield and learns what wood was always for. Across a ditch, someone calls a name that is not answered. For the rest of his days, he will wonder whether silence saved the person he loved or cost them. At the depot, a clock hand disobeys schedule. A conductor who could quote the book backwards moves his pencil over the margin and makes a check instead of a time. He hears a sound he decides to interpret as wind. He looks at a lantern that says, "Go," and thinks, "Not yet." John Wright arrives with 3 souls, then returns with 5, then sends another man with a whispered map fence line. Gully. Second pine. Wait for the low whistle. No paperwork changes hands. The only receipt tonight is the memory in another person's eyes. Somewhere between Rosewood and Sumner, a field picks up a rumor. Like a seed spreads it wild until even men who had promised their wives to keep to the porch feel it bloom in their chest as anger they can call useful. They go, not because they know, but because knowing is not required when the crowd offers certainty wholesale. The road grows crowded with headlights that act like arguments overlapping, glaring, refusing to be ignored. Tires leave black grammar on the dirt, writing a paragraph no editor will sign, but everyone will read. At the edge of the trees, a woman who never learned to swim wades into black water up to her waist because the world is different now and she is different in it. A child presses its face into her shoulder, learns how a heartbeat can be a lullaby and an alarm in the same bar. The night takes attendance with insects. A man whispers scripture not to change the mind of God, to change the shape of the fear inside his ribcage. A girl counts the seconds between torch glow sweeps and makes a small ledger of safety 4, 7, 3. Don't move on 3. From the carrier house, at last a sag, a complaining board, a joist that has heard too much heat without flame. Someone outside laughs too loudly, a sound that will embarrass him in the morning when the room is bright with loss, but the night nods as if it were part of the script. A shadow peels from the back door. Not a man, a plan wearing a man's outline through the garden, over the rail, to the dark under the trees. Every footfall is an argument with the earth to be quiet. Every breath is a negotiation with leaves. A mile away, the churchyard becomes a counting place. Names are whispered into a ledger that isn't paper into the ears of those tasked with remembering. Bradley, Morton, Carrier. Children with no last names tonight because a last name can be trouble. The hymn board lists numbers that won't be sung. Someone turns them all to 0, 0, 0, because blankness feels less like a lie than pretending you can sing under this sky. The deacon who keeps the key, he turns it in the lock and leaves it in the door, an invitation to anyone who needs a pew without questions. By the tracks, a figure waits at the milepost, the one with the nick from a lightning strike years ago. He hears the rails begin to hum, not loudly, just enough to promise. He steps out with a lantern shielded in his coat, shows it once, then hides it again, a heartbeat made of light. The train slides in like a long thought finally spoken. Doors open, not all the way, just enough. Hands lift hands. A bag that carries everything that can be carried, bread, a book, a photograph, is passed along. The conductor watches the dark for a law he can live with, finds only the faces of people who have paid enough for a ticket. The whistle does not blow. The train moves when breath does. Back nearer Sumner, a man with too much authority and not enough wisdom declares the night a victory as if terror were a sport. Paper will record his sentence. It will not record the way his mouth trembled on a consonant he could not quite own. Another man, one who shouted the loudest, sits alone on a stump for a minute and realizes his hands won't stop shaking. He pretends it's the cold. It isn't. Toward dawn, the swamp exhales a thin light. The church exhales a prayer with no words. The depot exhales the last hiss of a train that took what it could not enough, never enough. In houses that were not burned mattresses, remember the shape of people who did not sleep. In the carrier place, char works its way into the smell of everything. A stick of furniture maintains its dignity long enough to collapse in private. The road writes the night into its surface ruts and ash, and the fine gray print of feet that learned how to be quiet too quickly. And Rosewood, the name still fits its map, for the moment. But the incidents, small, sharp, multiplying, have done their arithmetic. The center has been asked to hold, and hold again. And something in the numbers says it cannot. The town counts what it has, names, hands a piano's blackened frame, a plan, then counts what is coming, trucks, men, morning conclusions, in distant offices, and feels the quotient drop. Even so, even now, people align themselves along the lines that matter. Some will stay to buy time for others. Some will move by night to stitch a path no rumor can follow. Some will carry a story out in their throats, so that decades later, when a stranger knocks with a notebook, there will be a voice to open the door. The night does not end, it thins. And in that thinning, choices harden. What was rumor is now routine. What was courage is now requirement. What was a house becomes a shrine. Then a lesson. Then ash in a jar a woman will carry to a new county, sprinkle on soil behind a new porch, and whisper too when she wants the old floor's song back. The rising incidents have risen. Dawn will not be kind, but it will be honest. And honesty, unlike rumor, has a way of holding still long enough to be named. Return to the paper. Not the rumor-soaked broadsides, not the porch talk recorded in pencil on air. The paper that files itself, numbers its own pages, and waits for someone patient enough to read. The sheriff's ledger grows heavy with verbs that dodge subjects, was fired upon, was believed, was necessary. The passive voice keeps doing its weather trick, clouding where the rain began. Meanwhile, receipts sharpen like winter light cartridges bought the day before a search, kerosene measured above Warden, an ordinary cold canvas, ordered for reasons no one will put in ink. A store account in Sumner ticks upward small numerals with large shadows, and in the margin a clerk leaves a dot where his hand wanted to write a name and did not. County inquests convene briefly. Briskly benches, polished flags, present men standing because standing looks like respect. Testimony arrives in the livery of certainty and leaves with its shoes muddy. A witness is sure at noon, nearly sure by dusk, can't recall precisely at night. Another witness remembers the glow, but not the face, the truck bed, but not the driver, the hour, but not the minute, as if memory itself had learned to protect its bearer by blurring men into weather. The final report chooses a narrow road. Deaths occurred during an exchange. The word exchange again laid down like a plank over a hole you're meant not to look into. Insurance companies answer with printed replies that feel colder than January riot, civil commotion, excluded peril. Policies that smiled during good weeks harden their jawlines. Fine print behaves like a lock that remembers an older key. A handful of claims make it past the desk, paid at fractions a roof, valued as if it were only shingles, a parlor priced as if music were replaceable. One adjuster, in a note he thinks no one will read, writes losses appear sympathetic, then scratches out the adjective and initials the correction. The carbon copy keeps the ghost of the word sympathetic pale but legible, a margin mercy refusing to disappear. Rail manifests tell their own mannered truth. Mileposts minutes a penciled hesitation where a train lingered for reasons operational. Railway police file a report, tidy, competent, no disorder aboard. The phrasing is not a lie. It is a proposition that the order in question was the quiet transfer of breath from a death sentence to a timetable. Conductors' logs feature uncharacteristic checks where times belong a code among men who understand that sometimes the correct figure is not a number, but a pause. You can hear the iron, steady, indifferent, and then notice the people operating it, not indifferent at all. Church minutes resume after their gap edges singed by absence and the handwriting has changed. The new secretary's script leans forward urgent. We agree to collect for those who lost. A tally of quilts, sacks of flour, an extra service with no sermon, only names. In the margin, small arithmetic comes to a whole number that has nothing to do with dollars. How many families can be placed in the outbuilding at rights for as long as it takes to stop shaking? The hymn selected for the next Sunday, make a paper theology, be still my soul. Guide me, O thou great Jehovah. A third title smudged where a thumb praying pressed a little too hard. School registers complete the sentence. P3 began. Attendance falls, then stutters, then composes itself in another county's roll book. A teacher copies out the names she expects to lose and writes a small star beside each she hopes to see again in March. The stars migrate later into a private notebook. On its last page, a scrap of handwriting from a child. Uneven proud, I can cipher faster than my brother. The page smells faintly of smoke. The teacher leaves Florida within the year, a line item in a ledger that will be totaled under precaution. Newspapers perform their dance with the truth. The near one cautious, the distant ones flattering their readers with certainty. Retractions arrive thin as winter sunlight tucked into corners where eyes rarely rest. A Gainesville editor, to his credit, publishes a second account that admits the first was over hasty. He loses subscribers and keeps his sleep. Another paper doubles down, order restored, as if restoration were a substance that could be poured back into burned boards. A short column on page 2 lists the names of the dead without bodies. The type is small, the consequence large. State correspondence thickens. Telegrams stacking like kindling. Advise, assist, stand by. Committees are proposed, then tabled, then scheduled, then postponed, pending further information. The phrase further information performs its own erasure. It implies that what survivors carry in their throats is not information, not yet until reproduced on paper under a seal. Months later, there is a hearing of sorts not in Levy County. Witnesses travel. Some sit with their hats in their laps and put their sentences down like offerings. Others stand and carry their fear into the room and set it on the table and ask the state to look at it a while. Transcripts on onion skin paper preserve every stutter, every false start, every time a name refuses to sit obediently inside a line and spills over the edge. The conflict between official prose and witnessed breath becomes the exhibit itself. Here is a deputy's statement. We did what was necessary. Necessary. The word thuds, then echoes. Here is a mother's counterstatement, unsworn but unshakable. We did what was possible. Possible. The word rises, then stays. An arithmetic emerges, necessary, served fear. Possible served life. The record files both without reconciling them. Reconciliation belongs to a slower tribunal. Years turn. The rumor hardens into lore in the mouths of those who prefer it unexamined, and softens into sorrow in the mouths of those who must live with it. And then decades later, the file is reopened by persistence disguised as curiosity. A survivor's child asks another question, writes another letter, refuses another euphemism. A reporter drives the old road and discovers that the map still hides a seam. A lawmaker listens not politely, but operationally, and a panel is formed with a mandate that is both simple and unprecedented. Count what can be counted, name what cannot, and put the state's name next to the word responsibility. Investigators fan out to archives, to kitchen tables, to storage rooms where photographs sleep in shoeboxes under winter coats. They compare church rolls to census sheets, insurance denials, to county minutes, train times, to oral timetables. They learn the language of absence, how to read where a page was removed, where a hand stopped writing mid-line, where a date was corrected without explanation. They learn the acoustics of honesty, the way an elderly witness pauses not to embellish, but to make certain she does not trespass into someone else's suffering. The report they draft does what earlier papers would not: names the act's names, the harm's names, the cost that cannot be made whole, and the cost that can at least be acknowledged in the ledger of a state that failed to protect its citizens. Reparations are debated loudly in some quarters, quietly in the rooms where the math happens. How do you appraise a parlor where a child learned scales and a mother kept the good shawl? How do you price the distance between a home and a holding? The calculus evolves. From never to perhaps to we must. Survivors register their names, hands shaking over forms that take longer to design than to fill. A commission recommends not charity compensation. The legislature slowly agrees. Checks are drafted with the cumbrous gravity of an institution learning to pronounce the word repair. A scholarship fund is established, thin balm, and yet a future written in other children's handwriting. And still, the folklore insists on standing beside the facts not to contradict, but to complete them. WPA narratives decades earlier had smuggled into the national record whispers about houses that remember roads, that keep a taste of smoked trains, that learn mercy at midnight. Those whispers now lend contour to the report's numbers. A line in the findings states families displaced, the folklore adds. And yet, in another county, a mother kept a jar of soil from the yard and named it home. The findings say properties burned, the folklore says, and the piano's charred harp still sang when the morning sun warmed its bent strings. The document says insufficient evidence for certain counts, the folklore says, because fear too leaves fingerprints, and we have not yet taught the lab how to lift them. What does it mean officially to remember? It means the state prints its apology on paper that will outlast the men who made the harm possible. It means a museum label will one day be read by a school group, and a chaperone will search the docent's face for a sentence sturdy enough to carry the shock. It means a road sign, modest green declarative, will say Rosewood, where maps had once gone coy, and drivers will pass it at 50 miles an hour and not know that time slowed to a crawl here once so that a train could be made to wait for breath. It means an entry in a textbook, an exchange in a classroom, a hand going up to ask, "How do we prevent a rumor from becoming a warrant?" and another hand answering, "By insisting that evidence outrun anger." The file closes again, but now with an index, with cross-references, with a humility printed in the preface. The folios go to climate control, the scanned pages to a server that will keep them in a night that always remains cool. The state's ledger gains a line under expenditures that is also a line under conscience. Survivors, those still breathing, sit for a photograph, not because they love cameras, but because you cannot repair without witness. The shutter blinks, a modest click. And in that sound, perhaps there is the thinnest thread connecting a past that burned to a present that at least admits the heat. Facts finally have done what they can. Not everything, never that, but enough to anchor the story in more than sorrow. Enough to give the folklore a firm hand to hold as it continues walking beside us, reminding, humming, resisting the erasure that once arrived, disguised as order. The documents rest. The voices do not. And the night, the one that thinned, teaches its last pragmatic lesson to the daylight that followed when men say, necessary ask for receipts. When men say, exchange ask for names. And when a train hums at the edge of town, remember that timetables are also ethics, and that sometimes to be right, a clock must learn to hesitate. It does not happen all at once. It never does. The night thins. The chorus of engines grows ragged. The air, hot with argument, begins to lose its breath. And then the moment that divides a story from a reckoning, a hinge in time, creaks open. A train slides in without fanfare. Steel on steel, along low vowel doors, not flung, but eased. One lantern cupped, one hand outstretched, one rule bent on purpose. It is not poetry to say a timetable hesitated. It is ledger truth, one unscheduled stop that stayed longer than the book allows, long enough for breath to climb aboard. Bodies move like sentences broken into clauses, carry, hush, lift, pass, cover. Go. Children first, then women, then men who keep glancing backward as if eyesight could be rope. A bag knocks a knee, a photograph slides against a loaf. A name is whispered into another person's ear because sometimes a mouth is the only archive that will open on time. The conductor does not count. Counting would be a kind of betrayal. He feels weight. He feels the car change its center. He feels obligation redefine itself in the brief theater of a corridor. Then a nod, the smallest verdict, and the train breathes, pulls, becomes distance. Behind the carrier house has learned all its lessons at once. Heat finds oxygen. Wood remembers its origin and gives itself back to it. What had been a room for scales and arguments and Sunday laughter chooses to be a statement, black absolute. Around it, men perform the old ritual of certainty. They talk louder than the truth. They pronounce names as if mispronunciation were possession. They count victory by volume. But the arithmetic shifts not because the flames dim, but because the town's center has slipped off their ledger and onto another. A piano's harp charred retains a note in its wire, a faint, stubborn hum that feels like sabotage to anyone who meant this to end in silence. Daylight, when it comes, refuses compromise. Smoke becomes a column the county cannot politely ignore. The road reveals what night hid ruts' footprints, a geometry of pursuit that will in time betray the men who thought anonymity was a mask you could keep. A deputy steps where he should not, and hears the ash speak under his boot, a crisp, accusing syllable. He writes order restored because his vocabulary is small and exhausted. Then he pockets the pencil and does the one decent thing he can make himself do. He points a latecomer with a rifle toward the wrong tree line and buys a woman 7 minutes. 7 minutes. A number so ordinary it sounds like weather. And yet in the story's spine, it is the vertebra that keeps the rest from collapsing. Inflection is not thunder, it is a tilt. At the depot, John Wright stands next to what looks like routine and behaves like deliverance. He says little the grammar of safety has few words, and all of them practical. He writes nothing paper can be compelled. Memory chooses when to comply. He folds one girl's hands around a ticket stub, not because the stub will be honored again, but because a child needs a shape to hold when the world has turned to smoke. He looks down the track and sees two possibilities, the train that is leaving and the men who might come insisting it should not have. For a second his face tenses into the future, the hearings, the insinuations, the price of helping, then relaxes into the present. A task finished, another begun. At the church, blankets unroll like liturgy. The deacon counts who made it across the ditch by naming who did not, a math of absences he hates himself for mastering. A mother wipes a child's face with a corner of her skirt and finds in the dust the old soot of another county, another year. We've been here before, her hands say, though her voice won't. Bread appears not enough, then enough, because the abundance here is not in loaves, but in the way they're divided. Someone hums the start of a hymn and stops, not because faith failed, but because the only song with the right words right now is made of breathing. By noon, the press has its phrases warmed up riot exchange order. But in the ledger that will outlast adjectives, there are harder numbers drawing their lines. How many houses no longer pretend to be houses? How many miles the train carried names past the county line? How many families clustered under a roof that voted in private to become sanctuary? One mark in a conductor's log where a time should be a check, a refusal to betray. And there will be another number, distant, delayed, improbable, that belongs to the same hinge in the story, 9 survivors who decades later will see their names followed by a sum not equal to loss, but equal at last to recognition. 9. The shape of a handful. The math of endurance. The count of people who prove a state can say we harmed you, and then without choking say we will pay. But before the future arranges its figures, the present insists on its own revelation. Men who thought themselves necessary learn they were mostly noise. A badge that believed itself sufficient learns it is only metal unless it arrives at the right time. A town that knew it was loved discovers it was also practiced, the training for survival having been done on quieter Tuesdays with smaller storms, so that when the worst weather arrived, the drills did not feel like theater. A conductor who is paid to obey a schedule understands in his bones that ethics has a clock of its own and that he chose the correct time. You can draw the inflection on a map. It is the line that begins at the carrier yard and bends not to Sumner, not to the courthouse, but to the tracks. It is the kink in the rumor's velocity, the place where pursuit lost sight of purpose and found only heat. It is the curve inside John Wright's signature, that day the curve that says a man is allowed to side with life and then accept the price. It is the swerve in a state's long sentence from never to maybe to yes when a commission decides that absence is evidence and evidence deserves ink with the authority to repair. Listen. To the moment when the piano wire cools, and with a last thin sigh, goes still. That is not silence, that is transfer. Sound becoming story, story becoming affidavit, affidavit becoming appropriation, appropriation becoming a scholarship with a child's name on it. The path is not straight. It wanders through decades of looking away, but it returns. It returns because a mother carried a jar of soil from a yard that smelled of pine and placed it behind a new porch 2 counties distant. Because a teenager refused to let her grandchildren forget the measure of that night. Because a conductor's checkmark, meaningless to anyone who didn't need it, remained on paper long enough to outlive everyone who did. The men who stood in the bed of the first truck will tell themselves later that they restored something. They will say the word order until it sounds tasteful. But order is not the absence of people you dislike. It is the presence of a justice you cannot edit. And the inflection proves it. The road once loud with intention quiets into a shame that pretends to be ordinary dust. The depot once plain acquires a halo. No camera will capture a place where a machine did a human thing and kept its mouth shut about it. The church, once only a room, becomes an archive, quilts as records prayer, as policy bread as budget. There is a second inflection, smaller private in a kitchen 3 towns away. A child asks why her grandmother keeps a cracked key on the mantel. The grandmother lifts it, rubs its teeth with her thumb, and says after a long, slow breath, "Because it opened a door we could not save, and because I am not finished opening things." That sentence travels farther than any headline. It bends the future a degree than another. It becomes a letter to a legislator. It becomes a question in a classroom. It becomes a day in a capital, when the word reparations, long allergic to oxygen, finally breathes without collapsing. Here is the truth fixed at last to one hard thing. Not a number printed in a column, but a choice engraved in an hour. The hinge was the minute a train chose people over punctuality. The proof is the lives that minute gathered up and pushed forward into decades that would otherwise have been blank. Tie it to the conductor's checkmark. Tie it to the 7 minutes John Wright stole from a mob by misdirecting a pair of angry boots. Tie it to the 9 names on the state's ledger when Florida improbably admitted that the absence in its files was a wound in its body. These are not metaphors, they are the joints in the story's skeleton. They are how the tale stands, so breathe. We are no longer inside the house, we are inside the hinge. The match has chosen what it would be. The fuel has confessed its nature. The rumor has found out it cannot write the ending by itself. From here, the camera will widen aftermath, echoes a road sign green against new sky, but do not rush it. Let the minute be a minute. Let the iron sing its receding note. Let the jar of soil be heavy in a woman's hands. Let a state, slow and imperfect, sign its name next to the word repair and mean it more than yesterday. The climactic truth is simple, stubborn, and payable. In actions, a town was hunted. A train waited. A handful survived. And the story, pulled across decades by people who refused to let the wire cool, cleared its throat and spoke. Morning does what mornings do, it insists. It lays light across scorched boards. It turns smoke from noun to memory. It walks the ruts where tires pretended to be law and invites the day to measure them. It finds a church with blankets cooling on the pews, a depot whose platform boards still hold the phantom weight of choices, and a town that has slipped not off the earth but off the part of the map that maps are comfortable printing. Rosewood. The word remains even when the boards do not. People carry it now in pockets and throats, in a jar of soil that feels heavier than dirt should, because weight is not only mass, it is meaning. The first days are arithmetic and weather. Who is missing? Who is safe? Who has not yet accounted for a phrase that pretends patience while practicing despair? Men who stayed sweep char with a tenderness that would look like worship if not for the grit in their teeth. Women who left count miles by him and breathe by child, each station a marker in the long sentence of still alive. Word travels faster than the trains now. It prefers whisper networks and kitchen tables, finds its way down the coast to Tampa, up the spine to Jacksonville, across to Tallahassee, where desks learn a new vocabulary: obligation, investigation, delay. Families learn a new grammar: if, until, unless. The night smell of pine and of something else, not fear exactly, but the ache a limb remembers after it's been wrenched and set. In the homes of cousins 2 counties away, furniture acquires accents. A chair that once belonged to a parlor in Levy County speaks in ash-dry syllables when you sit. A cracked key sits on a mantel, and people ask softly what door it remembers. Children fall asleep to stories that begin with geography. There was a place where our name lived and end with a map that is temporarily blank. They practice the old address in secret like a charm. They hear their elders say the word Rosewood in the same tone reserved for beloveds and for the dead, which is to say, the word is guarded and it glows. The legal daylight comes late and crooked. A grand jury declines, a judge thanks. A newspaper declares calm, as if calm were virtue and not simply exhaustion. Insurance letters arrive with mouths like steel traps. Exclusions, commotions, riots, acts. The paper does what paper does when frightened. It narrows it, hedges. It hides the subject behind a curtain of passive verbs. But the people do what people do when paper shrinks. They widen. They widen the table and put more chairs around it. They widen the story and pass it down like bread. They widen the circle of those who know until decades later a reporter hears the echo and follows it like a bird follows a current. Time, long time, teaches the county to pretend. Trees reclaim the edge of a foundation. Palmetto writes cursive over the footprint of a room where laughter once made the air rounder. A road forgets exactly where it used to bend to avoid a yard. The state adds lanes elsewhere, moves traffic like edits in a paragraph that once read slower. But forgetting is never complete. Hunters step into a clearing that shouldn't be a clearing and feel something stern in the soil, say, be respectful. A metal detector finds a nail that belongs to a piano, and the man who hears the tone thinks oddly of Sundays. A school bus passes a stand of pines, and a grandmother riding in the front on a field trip stares out the window and counts not trees but chairs once pulled away from a table in the dark. The folklore holds the line while the facts warm their hands. A neighbor remembers a train that waited, but he tells it sideways at first to see if the listener is safe. Someone else remembers the shape of a man standing where he had no business standing, and thus proved his business was mercy. There are dreams that visit an upright piano, a hand above middle C, a chord just about to be struck, and then choosing for once to become a door instead. In another town, a woman salts a stew, and when the steam rises, she smells kerosene and closes her eyes against a year she thought she had learned to fold. The WPA interviewer writes as much as he can in the 1930s, and the transcript comes to us with brackets around the parts English does poorly. The pauses and the inhalations, the grammar of grief. Slowly, the file cabinets concede. A commission is formed. It does not carry torches. It carries clipboards and tape recorders and the cautious hope that institutions like people can learn. Investigators compare church minutes to census rows, carry photographs that smell of vinegar and soot, knock on doors where the word Rosewood has lived in quiet dignity. They learn to treat silence not as absence, but as evidence needing translation. They sit with elders who do not perform for the record, but permit it. They hear the sound a house makes when its name is spoken aloud after decades underground. The report they produce does not overpromise, but it does not undername. It says what happened where it can. It says we failed where it must. It says repair where a government once would have said, hush. Reparations are argued in chambers and columns on porches. People ask the right wrong questions. How much is a parlor worth, as if money could price childhood? How much is a farm worth, as if value could be squared by acreage? Eventually, impossibly, the state signs its name next to the word pay. The checks are not heavy enough to equalize, but they are heavy enough to be heard when they hit a kitchen table. A scholarship fund opens like a window, and air moves through a house that has been sealed a long time. A grandson who never saw Rosewood reads chemistry under a fluorescent light, and hears somewhere in the hum a piano string remembering itself. A granddaughter lifts her hand in a courtroom and steadies her voice with the breath of women who taught her what steadiness is. The landscape joins the confession. A historical marker is set green, modest, unavoidable, and cars slow and the curious pull off, and a docent who has practiced saying steadies her voice in the presence of children who have not yet learned the human talent for looking away. A museum label uses words like community and destruction and acknowledges that community is not merely buildings. It is verbs: cook, teach, repair, praise. A road sign says Rosewood. A map app says Rosewood. A boy says to his mother from the back seat, "What happened there?" And the mother breathes, and for once the state's language in a brochure gives her a place to begin. In some homes, the jar of soil remains a small altar to location, dark, dense, patient. When the lid is loosened, the house shifts. You can feel it if you are the kind of person who knows how to listen to floors. A cracked key still watches from a mantel. The story it opens is told at holidays and in ordinary April afternoons, when someone needs courage. It is not a story about victimhood. It is a story about vocabulary, about a town that refused to let rumor be the final editor. The children who hear it grow up fluent in two languages, the factual one with its dates and ledgers, the folkloric one with its hymns and jars and trains that wait without being asked. Elsewhere, the men who were loud have learned to lower their voices, but the archive remembers at full volume. A box in Tallahassee breathes cool air and keeps onion skin transcripts crisp. Margins hold the ghost of words that clerks tried to erase. A conductor's checkmark sits in a log like an ember that never went out. When students lean over these documents, the room presses closer. Teachers ask gently, where did the passive voice hide the subject? And teenagers alert to evasion in every modern form, spotted instantly. An ethic emerges not hypothetical, not ornamental, practical, as a timetable when the crowd says, necessary, ask for receipts. When the report says, exchange, ask for names. When the schedule says, now remember that mercy sometimes keeps its own clock. There are pilgrimages, quiet ones. Descendants drive slow on the old road. They stand in a clearing and try not to imagine where the walls were, because imagining hurts and helps at the same time. Someone plays a hymn on a phone, and the pines who have been practicing patience for a century approve. Another leaves a small carving on the ground, a rose out of cedar, and the wind decides to carry the smell exactly where it needs to go. These are not ceremonies for cameras. They are calibrations, bringing the present back in line, with a truth that the past bent and then through persistence unbent again. Listen. Even now, there is a frequency at which the story hums. It's in the way a train always sounds a little different near an old milepost. In the way a quilt hung to air carries a note that isn't merely fabric flapping. In the way a child pronounces a place she has never seen with the intimacy of a nickname. Pay close attention, and you'll notice moments when the world answers a scholarship letter in a mailbox on a humid afternoon. A state house corridor where a representative moves a bill forward without clearing his throat. A courtroom where an apology is entered into the record, and the stenographer who has typed 1,000 ordinary days slows for one rich with weight. So we return as we promised to the motif that started this telling. The piano, even blackened, even skeletal, even more harp than instrument. It remembers. In a museum case, one scorched string is stretched beside a caption. A child asks if it still plays. The docent smiles and says, "Only if you're very quiet." Everyone tilts their heads. For a second, a breath. The building's air conditioning hushes, and a high, almost imaginary note seems to thread the room. Not sound exactly, but permission. The permission to hear. The permission to continue. And the train. Always the train. A timetable nailed to a depot wall in a photograph. A conductor's pencil still lying in a drawer 3 owners later. A story that begins for some families with the line, "We were lifted." In the calculus of justice, that hesitation measures longer than minutes. It measures as lineage. It becomes a boy wearing a graduation stole the color of pines. It becomes a girl arguing case law that did not exist when her grandmother needed it most. It becomes the ordinary miracle of a family reunion where the roll call includes names that might have been missing. We end not with neatness, history denies that, but with a steadied breath. Rosewood is not erased. It is written again and again by those who refuse the edit. It lives where a jar of soil rests, where a cracked key keeps watch, where a check mark in a log says, "We were not on time, we were right." It lives when a state spends money not to buy forgiveness, but to fund memory. When a sign lifts a name out of whisper and into wayfinding. When a film like this asks you to sit longer than you planned and to listen harder than you thought you would. The door, yes. The door is still a door, even if the house is gone. The names are still names. And the night which once had the arrogance to choose what to keep and what to burn has discovered a law older than its own darkness. The truth keeps choosing, and it keeps thinking.